Welcome to 10-Minute Edwards, where we learn the theology of Jonathan Edwards 1 minute at a time. I am Kyle Strobel, your host, and the clock starts now. Well, welcome to the 10-Minute Edwards podcast. As always, my co-pilot, Johnny E. in hyperspace himself. It is good to be with you as we get into this kind of question of Edwards' theology and his theological vision. And so I want to map a little bit of what I'm going to do for the next several episodes, because there is a certain way we have to approach Edwards' theology if we're going to take seriously his kind of self-understanding. Right? Edwards is coming after what's often called the Reformed High Orthodox. This is, for many, this is the kind of height of Reformed theology. And then you get a little bit of the kind of new world, like how do we make sense of God in an enlightenment age, right? And so you have what's often called like late orthodoxy, which Edwards would appear in, where they're now trying to navigate the realities of a new world. And if you're like Edwards, you're trying to do so faithfully to what has been handed to you, faithful to that tradition, while also creatively kind of reimagining how to actually engage in a distinctively reformed theological vision in a kind of post-Newtonian cosmology, in a post-Newton age, right? If to put it somewhat reductively, but that there's a lot going on in this age that someone like Edwards is trying to make sense of and trying to kind of situate the church, Christian belief, God in relation to creation, and all sorts of things. And so there's a specific kind of idea in Edwards' thought I want to hit on today. Remember, these are 10-minute segments, so I'm just trying to take one idea and trying to unfold them. But let me just read you a quote from Edwards here. He says, "Here is both an emanation and remanation. The refulgence shines upon and into the creature and is reflected back to the luminary. The beams of glory come from God and are something of God, and are refunded back again to their original, so that the whole is of God and in God and to God. And God is the beginning, the middle, and the end of this affair." So let me see if I can actually try to show you a little bit of what this might look like. So let me draw a little bit here. And so I want to explain a little bit of kind of what we, I think, need to do to talk well about Edwards and his theological vision. So you have God, right? And God is going to be in and of himself, right? It is going to be fullness, life, beauty, glory. God has no need, but nonetheless, God wills to create. And God creates the universe, he creates his creatures, right? And this we can think of as nature. And nature is good, right? He created it good. But of course, along with nature, we also have to talk about the fall. Now, importantly, I made this arrow right here, right? This arrow that's coming from God. The quote I just read talked about emanation and remanation. So that is flowing out towards, that's emanation. And then remanation would be somehow that comes back to God, right? But notice in this quote, he talks about the beams of glory. He talks about something of God is coming back to him as it has flowed out from him. Notice we're not in the realm of nature right now, but we're in the realm of grace. And so if we're going to talk well about what God is doing, we can't merely end with the fact that God creates. We have to look forward here to talk about the perfection of all things, right? We have to talk about eternity. Because it turns out that all of this moves cyclically. And if we're going to get at the very bottom here, there's going to have to be something that happens when God flows out by grace to not only create, but to recreate, to regenerate. He is creating anew in his creature something that now human persons born again have received something of God himself. This is what Edwards simply calls grace. And as we'll see, Edwards says true grace is divine. You see, in the nature of the gospel, God has given himself to you. He is recreating you so that you become, as 2 Peter 1:4 says, a partaker of the divine nature. And as you do so in regeneration, you are now rebounding this glory that you've received in regeneration. And this rebounding, what we could think of right here, is called religious affection. You see, religious affection is receiving the knowledge and the love of God himself, the knowledge and love that God knows in the inner life of God himself in full, that because of his glory, he overflows out of himself to his creatures to share his life with those he has called, so that as they receive his life, they rebound his life back to him. And so that means, if you'll notice, there are three levels here that we're going to have to talk about in turn. The first level, we're going to have to talk about God in and of himself, right? Because that's a good in and of himself. We should be captivated not merely by God in light of who he is for us, but we should be captivated because of who God is, that God is beauty and glory and holiness. But then secondly, we can't talk merely about the fact that God creates and then kind of move on from there. We have to talk about the fact that God creates and perfects. That there is a creation of time and then providentially upholding and establishing that time for eternity. And so again, it's going to be interesting. I mean, the first move will make sense to a lot of us. Well, we should start talking about God and then talk about creation. And if we're going to talk about creation, we need to talk about the fall. So like that all makes sense. But then to jump to eternity, to jump to heaven, to jump to perfection, that might strike us as a bit of a surprise. But we're going to need to see the fact that these two things are they're kind of playing off of each other a bit. They're helping us see, like, why is eternity the way it is? What has gone wrong in the fall, and what is being kind of redeemed, reconciled, and perfected in eternity? So we're going to have to look at those two things together because they're going to help us understand what the regenerate life is and what is going on in regeneration. And so there's this movement, and we'll see throughout Edwards' thought, he turns back to this kind of cyclical movement quite a lot. And so as the 10-minute Edwards unfolds, I'm going to be walking from the first to the second to the third of these kind of registers to help orient us a bit to how Edwards thinks and to kind of shape our minds along the contours of Edwards' own self-understanding in terms of his theology and in terms of how he understands this notion of emanation and remanation, right? That's weird language, I understand. But notice he's doing this language because he's trying to employ language that makes sense of God giving himself to us for eternity of sharing in God's life. And so I hope that is a bit of a glimpse that kind of helps you see where we're going and why we're doing it, but also maybe can help you see why Edwards is often known as the theologian of beauty and of glory, right? Because these are the very things that are captivating him. So thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Edwards. For more information about the Jonathan Edwards Project, check out kylestrobel.substack.com, where you can subscribe for free. All paid subscribers also have access to long-form content on Edwards, Reformed theology and spirituality, and the evangelical spiritual theology tradition that has a word-centered, spirit-empowered, full-life spirituality. Thank you again.